Did the apostles know Jesus is one of the more frequently asked questions on Google. It seems that there are people who claim the apostles who were responsible for the New Testament knew very little about Jesus, and so made up much of what is written in the New Testament. And this video explores this idea, and it shows that the people who wrote the New Testament knew Jesus very well and were able to give accurate accounts of his life, work, and teaching. So let's start off by thinking about what we mean when we say the apostles. When this question, it seems that the people are referring to those who led the earliest church, the New Testament church. And these were the people who were responsible for formulating the New Testament and for having it written. So we know the names of some of them. We've got them in the names of the books of the New Testament. We've got Matthew, he was an apostle. We've got John, another apostle. Mark, well, the information there comes from Peter, according to the earliest church sources. And of course, we've got the apostle Paul, who didn't write any gospels, but did write a whole lot of letters. So almost everything that we know about Jesus comes from the apostles. It's not quite true, because there are plenty of sources outside the New Testament which tell us a lot about Jesus. We could put together a general outline of his life from sources outside the Bible. But nevertheless, the detailed knowledge of Jesus comes from the apostles, and it's there in the New Testament. And the question that we've got is, did the men who wrote these gospels, did these people know Jesus? Could they give an accurate account of what Jesus said and did? I want to start off by looking at the time scale, to see whether it was possible for people who knew Jesus to be available to write the New Testament. And this is a time chart. This end here, we've got the resurrection, which happened probably in 30 AD or possibly in 33 AD. I'm going to put it as early as possible because that gives the biggest gap. We can see that even with the big gap, that gives us a picture which is perfectly acceptable. The rest of the dates we can put in that allow us to fix times. We know about the fire of Rome in 64 AD. We know about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We know about a Jewish war which started in 66 AD and went on, well, it sort of petered out in 74 or maybe the end of 73. And we can do quite a bit of work on Acts and the letters. When you do the work, you find that there's a tremendous correspondence, but we come up with dates for the letters of Paul, the earliest one being Galatians, which must have been written in 48 AD, before the Council of Jerusalem. And we end up with writing which happens in the winter of 63 to 64 AD. So we know when Paul was writing, and we know how long it was after the resurrection. And having looked at those, we can put in a bit more work, and we can get the other letters of Peter and of John and Jude. And these fit in more or less at the end of the letters of Paul. They come in around about the time of just after probably the fire of Rome, when the persecution of Christians was just getting underway. So having got that framework, we can then work out when the Gospels were written, and the earliest of those seems to have been Mark. And we can work out that must have been written between 50 and 55 AD. We've got Luke, which is written just before Acts. Acts we can date fairly thoroughly to fairly early on in 62 AD. So Luke must have been written somewhere when Paul was in prison, either in Caesarea in Israel, or maybe he was imprisoned in Rome. But somewhere over that period, the Gospel of Luke must have been written. We've got the Gospel of Matthew, which I think was written after Luke. Certainly it was written before 70 AD, and it doesn't seem to be written while there was a war going on between the Jews and Rome. So almost certainly before 66 AD, but there are people who put it as early as 40 AD. That to me seems far too early, but I put it definitely between 62 and 66 AD. And finally, we've got the Gospel of John, again, definitely written before 70 AD, almost certainly written before the start of the Jewish war between the Romans and the Jews, and written after the death of Peter, which must have happened late in 64 or early in 65 AD. So again, we've got a date for the Gospel of John. So we can look at those on the time chart, and we can compare those with the lifetime of a hypothetical apostle or hypothetical witness. So let's say the chap we're talking about was 25 years old at the time of the resurrection. So he'd be able to go along and look at things, he'd have a pretty good idea of what was happening. So he's 25 when the resurrection happens. He's in his 40s when the Gospel of Mark is written. In his 50s when the Gospel of Luke is written. Matthew's written when he's about 60, maybe just before, maybe just after, and John is written while in his very early 60s. So certainly it's well within living memory. An apostle who saw the resurrection could easily have written one of these Gospels, or could have written the letters, or either Paul or some of the other letters. It's well within living memory. While the average lifespan, everyone keeps telling you, was quite short, that's because there's a huge child mortality. If you survive being a child, you've got a pretty good chance of living more or less as long as people do now. John lived apparently until he was almost 100 years old. So we could have apostles who lived on to the time when the books were written very easily. The point is that the New Testament is written in the lifetime of witnesses who saw the events that are being reported in the New Testament. All right, let's think about the individual apostles then. So we start off with Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. So let's talk about that first. And the tradition of the people who followed on the next generation, started to write about these things, was that Matthew was the tax collector from Capernaum who became one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And that would make him a pretty good eyewitness to much of what happened, certainly to the things that he reports in his gospel. How will we know if it's correct? Well, the trick is to look at details in the text and see whether they support the idea that the book was written by a tax collector from Capernaum. Well, the first bit of evidence is the set of geographical details in the gospel. Now, Matthew's gospel is pretty accurate when it describes what goes on what I'm going to call the north coast of the Sea of Galilee, along here between Gennesaret and Bethsaida. There, he knows the geography extremely well. It's a bit hazy when he goes inland. If he goes to Nazareth, well, he's got a bit of an idea, but anywhere else, and it gets fairly hazy, and he's certainly hazy about what's going on further south. But the bit around Capernaum he knows very well, which suggests someone who spent a lot of his life in Capernaum, as Matthew, the tax collector of Capernaum, would do. Second point, he's got a tremendous interest in taxation. He talks about things to do with taxes which are absent from other gospels. As an example of one, he talks about discussing things, and people come and ask, do Jesus and the disciples collect the temple tax? And they discuss it, and in the end, there's actually a miracle associated with it. But nonetheless, the point is, it's Matthew's interested in the taxes. And third point, this phrase, the house. Now, in Greek, that would mean home, my house. You would refer to your house as the house. And Matthew uses that phrase, and he uses it to identify the house of Matthew, the tax collector. So there's an example. We've got Jesus reclining at table in the house. It says, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. So there they are. And if we look in parallel accounts in other Gospels, we find that this is Matthew's house. So Matthew's house is known as home in Matthew's Gospel, but it's known as Matthew's house in the other Gospels. Again, that's something that would put Matthew in with Matthew's Gospel. So there are lots more besides that, but that's three little bits of information that help us to understand that Matthew, the tax collector of Capernaum, was the man who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Mark. Again, we have a picture of how it was written from 2nd century writers, that the earliest of those is Papias, but other people say the same story. And then what they say is that Peter went on a preaching trip and he gave some talks about Jesus, and Mark took the information from Peter, he edited it a bit, compared it with what Peter said, went to Peter and confirmed it, and then ended up publishing it as his gospel. It went to the people to whom Peter was teaching, so that they had a record after Peter had left them behind and was elsewhere preaching the gospel. And again, the detail in the text confirms that. So, for example, this word, the phrase, the house. In Matthew, it identifies Matthew's house. In Mark, it identifies Peter's house. So, slight switch, but nonetheless, it's showing that Peter is the main source of information for the Gospel of Mark. Second point is that when you look at the various different incidents, up until the death and the resurrection of Jesus, Peter is present at every single one of those incidents. They're all looked at. Not only is Peter there, but they're looked at from Peter's point of view. And so we got this connection with Peter that you don't get in the other Gospels. And there are a whole lot of technical details in the way that the Gospel is put together. There's one example. It's the idea of the plural to singular construction, it's known as. So it says, as they went into Capernaum, so they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and he being Jesus. And well, what's going on? Well, what's going on is that Mark is reporting someone who said, we went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he, Jesus, went into the synagogue. And you find that when you get that construction, there's always a particularly vivid description of what was going on, which indicates an eyewitness saying what's happening. And this they to he construction indicates an eyewitness, and it's always from Peter's point of view. So it's another suggestion that Peter is the source of information for Mark. And you can put the two together and see how you go. So here we are, a passage from Matthew. This is the just before the parable of the sower. And it starts out, Jesus went out of the house. It's in Matthew, it's Matthew's house. It says, and he sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. So the crowd's on the beach, and they're looking at Jesus in the boat, and there he is teaching them. Okay, let's look at the parallel in Mark. So now we've got it from Peter's point of view, and it doesn't say anything about the house. There's nothing about Matthew's house at all. It says he began to teach beside the sea, a large crowd gathered, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the crowd was beside the sea on the land. Notice that the actual wording is different. The narrative that Matthew has written is not just a copy of what Mark wrote, and Mark hasn't just copied from Matthew. They're two independent accounts, and there's little difference. Matthew talks about what happens in the house, so that it starts off with Jesus and Matthew in Matthew's house. Jesus goes down with Matthew to the seashore, and he begins to teach by the sea. That's where Peter picks them up. Either Peter's there already, or maybe Peter comes out and joins in. So when Peter sees it, they're already by the side of the sea, and so the detail of the story starts there. interesting now is to compare that with the Luke account. Luke wasn't an eyewitness at all. Luke was a totally different person. And it says there, a great crowd gathered, and people from town to town came to him, and he said in a parable, and then it gives the parable of the sower, which is what follows on from the other two accounts of what's happening. So Luke wasn't an eyewitness. Luke doesn't report the circumstances. Matthew reports the circumstances that Matthew would see, and Mark reports the circumstances that Peter would see. And you can see this connection between the Gospels and the relevant apostles. Well, that's the sort of the way we're going to look at things. We just had this brief look at the internal evidence that shows the apostles were eyewitnesses, and there's more to come. And question, have we made a good case? Is it the kind of evidence that's useful? Let us know what you think about it in the comments that you'll find with this video. Let's go on now and think about John. We can track down quite a lot about how John was written. First of all, John's Gospel was written by someone who is obviously a follower of the Jewish religion. It's got lots of detail and an explanation, for that matter, of Jewish law and Jewish custom. Second point, it's a writer who is from Israel, or maybe call it Palestine, and you know that because he's familiar with the geographical detail of the region. Example, John's Gospel, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is called in Aramaic Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So he's talking about the pool of Bethesda, and it's been excavated by archaeologists. That's an archaeologist's reconstruction of that pool. And you can see there it has the 5 colonnades, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So John is familiar not just with that detail, but lots and lots of places. He talks about the well at Samaria. He talks about what it's like in Nazareth and such like places. He knows the area. He's familiar with this geographical detail. So he's someone who is from Israel or Palestine. Third point, he has tremendous detail of all sorts, detail of the geography, detail of the journeys, details of times, numbers of things. When they catch fish, he says how many they caught, and so on. So that indicates he's got an interest in fish as well. But as an example, he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So there's a detail. It's where it was. It's in Samaria. It's Sychar. It's near Jacob's field, or Joseph's field that Jacob had given him. It says Jacob's well was there, another detail. And Jesus was tired from his journey. So that's another one. And it says he was sitting down. It says sitting down like this. It says on the well. A lot of translations miss that detail. They translate it as by the well and leave out the like this. But it's there in the Greek. And the point, of course, is that no one ever sat down to write something and put that in. They would tell someone about it, and they would include that in their description. It actually would sit down and say, it sat down like this, and somebody else is writing it, it's taking dictation, and it's written down like that. But it's an eyewitness point. It's not something that someone says unless they are an eyewitness. And we know the time of day as well. It's noontime, 6th hour. So there's this huge amount of detail that's there in it, which indicates an eyewitness. Again, it's circumstantial, but it's what you get from an eyewitness. It's not what you get from fiction. And there are details of thoughts, of actions, the feelings. You get the private discussions of the disciples. You even have the order of seating at the Last Supper, which you can work out from the account in John's Gospel. What does that tell us? Well, it indicates someone who is one of the disciples of Jesus, one of the 12, and probably a lot closer than that. Now, interesting point. In John's Gospel, there's one disciple, no, actually 2 disciples never mentioned. There's John and there's James, the brother of John. And James isn't quite so important. John is a hugely important disciple. Peter, James, and John, James is mentioned. Peter, James, and John are the three disciples closest to Jesus. And John is particularly close. He's never mentioned. You've got to account for why that will be the case, and that there are two reasons you might have. One is that the person who wrote John's Gospel didn't know about John the disciple. Now, that's pretty unlikely because John is a very prominent disciple of Jesus. The other possible reason is that the person writing it is John. That seems much more likely. He doesn't mention himself. He doesn't mention his brother. Why not James? Well, James was killed before 44 AD in the reign of Herod Agrippa I. So if the gospel was written by James, and it was written very early, I suspect it wasn't written quite that early. It seems to be written after the death of Peter. So there's only John left, James being dead already. So that tells us that the writer of John's gospel really is John. And John makes every claim to be an eyewitness. Here we have the letter of John. So you look at the style of it, it's so like the gospel, the two have to be together. And the letters, well, it's obviously written with the gospel of John in mind. And my belief is that it's a letter that was to go round with the gospel. And it starts off, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked on and touched with our hands. He says that life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you eternal life, which was with the Father and made manifest to us. And he then goes on to say, that which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you. He's claiming to be an eyewitness, and he's saying he's an eyewitness who is talking about the things that he has seen. He's telling them to you. Well, that doesn't happen in the letter, but it does happen in the gospel. So probably here he's referring to the gospel which goes with this letter, and he's saying this is what we have seen, what we've looked on, what we've touched. That's what we're telling you about. It's a definite claim to be an eyewitness. And you get it inside the gospel. Here we are at the foot of the cross, and sees Jesus' side being pierced by someone with a spear. And he says, he who saw it has borne witness, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you may also believe. John is an eyewitness, and here he is telling us that he is the man who wrote the gospel. He really is an eyewitness. So again, let's look at another example. This example is the feeding of the 5,000. I want to draw your attention to a little detail in it. So Matthew writes about it, and he says that Jesus ordered the crowd to sit down, and he says on the grass. There was grass there, and he tells the crowd to sit down on it. Now, Mark describes the same thing. So Matthew was there, he saw it. Peter was there, and he says he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. That's an interesting thought, the green grass, because, in a hot summer, you see it even in Britain, the grass goes brown in the summer. In the Eastern Mediterranean, then it happens every year. So when you get to the end of the spring, sort of heading for Pentecost, the grass goes brown. It doesn't go green again until the next year when the rains come. So there's green grass. John, Jesus says, have the people sit down. And it says there was much grass in the place. So John was there, and he remembers the grass, and it's green grass. And you can tell it's the right time. It's a Passover time when the grass would be there at its greenest. It's the growing season for the grass, and there's been rain and it's growing, and you can see green grass around. Luke wasn't there, and he records what Jesus says: have them sit down in groups about 50 each. Again, they're all summaries. They miss out different bits because they're summarizing for different purposes. Doesn't mention the grass. Luke doesn't mention the grass. He wasn't there. So the other three, they're remembering what they saw. There's an irrelevant detail, a detail of the grass, but they put it in because it stood out. It was something they remembered. Luke didn't remember it. He doesn't write it down. He wasn't there. Right, well, we looked at the Gospels. Let's look at some of the letters. I'm going to talk about the letters that Paul wrote. Of course, Paul doesn't write the Gospel. The letters are written for specific purposes to deal with problems that were going on in the churches around. They're not intended to be a history of Jesus, but they do contain some of the sayings and actions of Jesus. Just a little bit of it here. They say he was a Jewish man. They say he was a good man. They say he was a descendant of David. They say that he had 12 close disciples. It says, let us say that he had some brothers. One of the brothers it names as being called James. They say he was crucified. And let us say that he rose from the dead in many different places. I've put one of the verses in there that says it, and that's Galatians chapter 1 and verse 1, and that's certainly the first verse of one of Paul's letters, and quite likely the first verse to be written down of the whole of the New Testament. And it's there is the resurrection. It's part of it. There's plenty more we could do. Paul quotes the occasional saying of Jesus. He refers to the breaking of bread, the Last Supper, and he gets the bread, and he gets the cup, and he gets them in the right order, and he gets an account of the things that Jesus said at that time. Paul knew what Jesus said and did. Again, he doesn't report it verbatim from the Gospels in the main point, for the main part. He is giving another account. He's giving an account of things that he knew about from Jesus. Did he see Jesus? Well, there's a passage that says maybe he did. He says, am I not free? He's appealing to the apostles. Am I not an apostle? He says, have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And Paul appears to have seen Jesus, if not anything else. He might not have been a great companion of Jesus. He might have been too young, for example, to really follow Jesus around when he was in Jerusalem or go and argue with him. But nonetheless, he'd seen him. And that indeed was what we needed for him to be an apostle. That was the condition that made someone an apostle. So after the death of Jesus, or around that time, Judas commits suicide. He might even have committed suicide before Jesus had died. So suddenly the 12 disciples have become 11. And after the ascension of Jesus to heaven, the other disciples get together and they say, we need to appoint somebody else to this committee of 12 disciples. And they go and select somebody. And the first thing they do is they say, well, what are the criteria? What do we need of someone who's going to be one of the apostles? And they talk about one of the men who've accompanied us during all the time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us. One of these men must become with us a witness of the resurrection. Now, they're talking about one of the 12, but they're saying having seen Jesus, having a good knowledge of what Jesus said and did, is vital to the position of being an apostle. For other apostles, there were more than the 12, that might be a little bit more stringent. They may relax that a little bit, but you're definitely saying that it's someone who can be a witness, someone who has met Jesus, someone who knows what Jesus says. That's what you need to be an apostle. And that's the point about the New Testament. The apostles wrote it, and the apostles knew Jesus. Peter writes it, he says, we didn't follow cleverly devised myths when we were made known to the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Peter is saying very clearly, we knew what we were talking about because, or we know what we're talking about because we were eyewitnesses of the things we are reporting. Well, talked about the apostles. What about Luke? Luke's an evangelist, but he wasn't an apostle. What he was a companion of the Apostle Paul at various passages where he refers to himself as being part of it. We did this, he says. And he met various other apostles. And in fact, he stays in Jerusalem. He has access to all sorts of people besides apostles. He says, when we came to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. Notice this we and us thing. We had come to Jerusalem, received us gladly. Paul went in with us. He is among those people. And he meets James, who is the chief apostle in Jerusalem and the brother of Jesus. And so Luke had met the Apostle Paul as a companion of the Apostle Paul, and he's met James, the brother of Jesus. Luke might not be an eyewitness himself, but he has an access to eyewitnesses. And he stays in Jerusalem. Later on, you can track him going on a journey, maybe more than one, where he visits the places where Jesus did various things. But Luke knew what he was talking about. He talked to people who had seen it. He was there to find out what the truth was about what Jesus did and what Jesus said. James is the brother of Jesus. He's a chief apostle. Paul, the other one in there, he's an apostle as well. And those are people that Luke definitely had access to. But as I said, he stayed in Jerusalem. He stayed in Palestine, possibly in other places as well. And he met people who had seen Jesus, and he could ask them about what had happened, and he could write it down in his gospel. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video, found it interesting. If you did, why not subscribe to the channel and look out for other similar videos? Or you could visit our website, there's the address. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, because more are coming out every week. There's another video. And of course, let us know what you think of this video in the comments.